Good evening and welcome to Sex is Medicine, your number one resource for holistic sex education. I am Devi Ward and I am so thrilled to be here with you all this evening and thrilled to have a wonderful guest to share his wisdom and his knowledge and his joy with all of us. And so yes, on to our guest this evening is Lee Harrington, and I had the privilege and the pleasure of meeting Lee at the Sex Down South conference last October in Atlanta, Georgia. And I saw him across the room and he saw me across the room and we just started talking. And then I got an opportunity to watch him perform on the stage. And it was just an extremely juicy and titillating experience, I must say. And then serendipitously, we were on the same plane home. It was so awesome. And then we had a joint layover. So we got to spend some time in the Seattle airport getting to know each other. And so I was very excited to have the opportunity to have Lee on our show this evening because he is an incredibly prolific writer on the topic of gender and rope bondage and BDSM. He is an internationally known spiritual and erotic authenticity educator, gender explorer, eclectic artist, and an award-winning author and editor on human erotic and sacred experience. And he is just a wonderful, very beautiful human being. Thank you so much for being with us here this evening, Lee Harrington.
Oh, it's my honor. I'm so excited to get to be on your show.
Yay! Yeah, because I got to be on your show a while back.
I know. I get to lure you into my world. It's a good thing.
I like it. I like it.
In the most consensual and loving way possible.
Yes. Well, you're very delicious. So I'm happy to be lured into your world. So as I was saying, I checked your website is wonderful and amazing. And you are such a prolific writer. I am so impressed with how many books you've put out. How many books have you actually written?
I have 8 books with my name on the cover that I've written, 2 that I've edited, and then I've appeared probably in another 12 or 14 anthologies, something like that.
Wow. So that is just so impressive to me.
Thanks. Yeah, it's, I joke, but it's kind of true that my brain won't always stop and it has to come out my hands.
Yes.
So, and actually I have people laugh about it because they're like, aren't you done teaching? And I'm like, no, when I stop talking, when I'm not teaching or having conversations, my fingers start moving. Actually, back in 1998, still late teens, and I started back when you called them online journals, right? This was back in 98. And I started an online journal that I just kept talking about sexuality and authenticity and my erotic adventures, which, funny enough, when there's not that many sexy, like this was, that was 98, so 17, 18 years ago. And there weren't many sex blogs back then, back when we called them online journals, right? And so it was really interesting because that's kind of ended up spurring me on to this path of exploring my sexuality publicly because I was already doing this, posting to a few friends here and there. And suddenly when it's hundreds and then thousands of people following my sex life, it ended up leading not just to adventures, but also led to me really looking at my erotic life as being part of who I am because the world was suddenly involved in the conversation.
And so speaking of your erotic life, you've had quite a diverse and widespread erotic adventure and you said, we were talking before the show, and so you started on this path when you were 16, is that right?
So yes and no. I started exploring I gender transitioned. I think that's important for the audience, to the listeners, to everybody out there in the world who doesn't know to know. I now live and operate and am legally male, but I only began that chapter of my presentation about a decade ago. And so I was in my teens and I got a fake ID, and I'd already been interested in, spicy sexuality, shall we say, whether people call it BDSM or kinky sex or just being an adventurer. right? Trying out new things. And I'd already been doing that privately with, a boyfriend here and a girlfriend there. And I got a fake ID and showed up at my first public play space, right, which is one of the slangs in the kinky sex communities for a gathering location for people to explore their, consensual hedonism together. And I showed up to my first play space, my first play party, and never looked back because I had been doing stuff privately. And I found by showing up at this event, I remember my very first time. I was there and I was in the social area, and there was a woman getting a spanking from a lovely gentleman. And she said some word and he stopped spanking her. Yeah. Like she'd been screaming and moaning and then starting to get really uncomfortable, like in a bad pain way. And she said a magic word and he stopped. And I looked over at the person next to me and said, "So what just happened there?" And they said, "Well, she used her safe word." And I went, "Well, tell me about that." Well, and they're like, "Well, but haven't you explored privately?" And so I'm like, "Oh yeah, but humor me." Because I was ashamed to say that. I didn't know what a safe word was.
Uh-huh.
And I found out that a safe word is a cue that you can still be doing role play of, "Oh no, and please don't." But then if you say that word, like screwdriver, it's unlikely you will say screwdriver in the middle of having sex.
You might say hooray, though.
You might say hooray. And so here was this thing, and I'd never heard of that. And so before that, playing privately, I had some really intense kinky sex that involved intense sensation that had crossed over from intense sensation into actually suffering. But not having a word to differentiate them, because I didn't want my partner to stop doing intense sensations with me, but I didn't have a word to say, "Hey, can you stop for a moment? I need to explain what's going on." So I just was quiet. I just was like, well, I don't want him to stop, and so therefore I won't do anything.
Mm-hmm. So the safe word was very liberating for you then.
Well, it really is, because especially when I'm exploring with someone new, it's a way for me, if I want to do role playing like that, it's a really great way for me to dive in and still feel safe enough that I can step out of the role playing. But for me, when I play with people that I already know, or that we're not going to do any role playing like that, I'm a really big fan of communicating with your partner or partners or lovers in a really loving way. Mm-hmm. So for example, your hand is, you're being held down in like a struggle kind of way, but you're not, saying, "Oh no," it's just like help. I'll sometimes say like, "Ow, that actually hurts." And when you drop your voice like that, right, it doesn't sound sexy anymore. And so it tells me, oh, wait, my partner's actually trying to communicate with me. Or even better than "ow, that hurts," "Oh, yum, I liked it when you were doing that other thing more, though. Mm-hmm. Can we do more of that? That was so luscious."
Mm-hmm. I love that right there, because when I teach sexual communication to people, when I first break it out of the box, they're like, "Well, how do I talk about what I don't like?" And I'm like, why are we going to start with what you don't like? How about we start with what you do like? Like, let's focus on what's working. And when we put lots of focus on what's working, chances are we're going to get more of that.
I know, it's so amazing to me. In some parts of the BDSM community, which is an acronym for bondage, discipline, dominance, submission, sadism, and masochism, but people use that term, but I like the word kinky sex or adventurous sexuality, because sometimes people have a picture in their head, right, of bondage and discipline. It needs to look like a certain picture. And I find my sex life doesn't always match the picture in other people's projections.
That's a good thing. I think it's a good thing if our sex lives don't match with other people's ideas of what they should be.
Well, no, but people have this story that, "Oh, you do all this kinky sex stuff," and I'm like, well, actually, I'm right now actually recording from my dungeon space, which is also my temple. Yeah, it has 2 overhead points for like people to be able to like take some ropes up to the ceiling or whatever, and I have a bundle of ropes in one corner that's in this beautiful stack and canes in another. But it's also all decorated with flags, and it has a walkable labyrinth on the ground. And so when I tell people, "Oh, I'm going to go do some, hot SM play tonight," people have this picture of like, "Oh, it's going to be in an industrial dungeon." And I'm like, well, it is my dungeon, but really it's my temple. And so for me, when I started using this language other than that, and I like the idea with BDSM and kinky sex, one of the big things it teaches is consent. is you need to clearly communicate with your lovers, but more than that, clearly communicate with yourself. Because even if the words can't come out of my mouth, that, you know what, that time you hit me with a cane and people think, oh my God, you're hitting like full stroke, you know, like a Taiwan, you know, a Thai prison camp kind of thing. And I'm like, no. No, what we're doing is doing percussive rhythm as if my lover is a drum.
Well,
but that's not the picture people have, right?
Right. And I have to say, when I saw you perform in Atlanta, I mean, it was just erotic and sensual. I mean, I was getting hot and wet and juicy and turned on. It was one of the most beautiful things I've ever seen. It was just like so sensual, and there was just such presence and such intimacy and such passion in what you were doing. Could you describe a little bit about what was going on? Do you remember the scene I'm talking about?
I do. I do. And for people watching who want to see it, if you type in the words passion and soul in one word anywhere on the internet, you get my website, you get my YouTube channel, because to me, those are the two really important things in my life, are passion and soul. And I've got it up on my YouTube channel. But there's an art form, or a passionate tool, or whatever you want to call it, called Shibari, which is a Japanese term for to bind. Right? That's all it means. It just means to bind something.
Okay.
Right? And then there's another term it's to tie. And then kimbaku is another term that gets used more in Japan, which is to bind. Right? It's the same concept. It's just different words for the same thing. They both happen to be Japanese words. The word Shibari gets used more in the West because it's the word that got popular over here in the late 90s. Okay. That's all. It was the first word that made it over here, and of the two. And so it's kind of, at this point, some people use it as, oh, well, Shibari is all the westernized stuff. And I actually have a pair of books called Shibari You Can Use and More Shibari You Can Use, kind of, you know, taking a little bit an aim at that, but making it, demystifying it, because at the end of the day, it's about connection, right?
Yes.
And so it's about the aesthetics of rope tied in with the connection of rope. There's some rope bondage out there that's just for the damsel in distress, visual effect, or for the role playing, right? And that can be really fun. It's kind of like people who want to put on the little costumes and be sexy for the evening. Cool. And I can use rope bondage for doing that if you're doing the damsel in distress thing, or tying somebody down to the bed and doing the oh no thing. But I love the kinds of connective rope I do because it's not about the knots. It's not about the ties. It's not about what cinches you know how to do here and memorizing 3,000 techniques. For me, it's about taking one piece of rope and imagining that your arms extend out into the rope as if they're ivy wrapping around your lover. That idea that rope is made out of a natural fiber, and it physically will echo out anything that comes out of that. Any sensation it receives, it carries it forward. There's actually a great trick in rope bondage of tying rope around, through someone's crotch, and then holding a vibrator 5 feet away on the rope.
Oh, wow.
Because it will transmit. And I think of that kind of on an emotional level, to that idea of transmitting emotional vibrations. Rope can do it with emotions, with physicality, with all of that. And I did a performance that was me and 2 rope bottoms, or rope models. And bottom simply means the person receiving a sensation. It's the yin of the equation. And, and I'm me being the yang, the active giver, or top, or artist, right? There's lots of terms for the same thing. And I brought the 2 of them on with these head harnesses that I'd woven on that were what I call erotic macrame. Right? It's macrame woven on someone's body in a way that titillates or causes erotic charge. Or in our case, it was both of them getting to close their eyes as I took these strands of fiber over their faces and wove them into the pattern that when people in the audience saw it, it looked really almost industrial, but I had taken the yarn, right, the line off of one of their heads and attached it to the other one. So when they were walking, they had to stay in perfect pace with each other, like a pair of twins, like a pair of Siamese twins. And when I had them both on stage, I then took these just pieces of rope. I had them set aside, and I would just wrap rope around one and then have them get down on the ground and then rope around the other. And for me, I had a whole bunch of rope on stage, just like I do when I'm in the bedroom. I'll have a whole pile of rope there, not because I'm going to use all of it, but because in case one piece gets tangled, I'd rather be connected with my partner than untangling a piece of rope. I'm there to be with them, not the tool, not the piece of equipment. It's about being present in the moment and knowing that their submission to you is a present. It is a gift.
So is that what is so erotic about rope? Is that it is a practice of presence?
For me, it is. Mm-hmm. For some people, it's practicing the act of surrender. That I am entrusting. I am trusting so much. And I am entrusting my body to you. That I am in this moment believing that for the length that I am bound, you are going to care for me as well or better than I would. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And that's, right, for me at least, that's a profound act.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. It's, a profound act of surrender and trust.
Yeah.
And I imagine that would be very healing for people who perhaps have those trust issues or haven't felt that support or haven't felt that tender care or that ability to just let go in the presence of another.
Absolutely. And I've done stuff with other people, though, that it's about the sensations, right? That just enjoy sex for being in the moment of sex. Mm-hmm. And for a lot of us, I've had these moments where I used to work for a period of time, I worked at Home Depot, right, on the cash register back when I was in college. And I would dissociate from my body because I was working on a concrete floor all day. Mm-hmm. If I was present in my body all day long, I would be horrible. Mm-hmm. Like I would just be emotionally drained. And so what I would do is I would almost shut my body off. And then when I was tying someone up, not only did it bring me present to the moment, but suddenly I would close my own eyes and feel the fibers in my fingers. Mm-hmm. And it would make me stop and feel their skin. And then it would remind me to, stop and feel my skin. And it would bring me back into my body.
Mm-hmm. So it's like a meditation.
Yeah.
A sensual meditation practice.
Yes, absolutely. And I have a book out called Sacred Kink that's about not just this technique, but how the tools that are used in alternative sexual practices almost all appear in religious and spiritual practices worldwide.
Oh, so you have to tell us about that, please, or as much about it as you're willing to reveal on air.
Absolutely. Well, the reason I bring it up is I have a practice in there from what's called the Path of Flesh that is sensual meditation, where I have someone close their eyes and take a piece of rabbit fur or a piece of silk. Mm-hmm. And just run it over your skin and take that moment and describe it out loud and be present with it, all while being erotically charged. Mm-hmm. There's actually a teacher who's a spiritual and sexual teacher of mine who, and kink teacher named Master Skip Chasey, who was a theologian for the Metropolitan Community Church. And, as a Christian minister, or as a Christian follower, I should say, but is also a really devout gay Leatherman. And his big thing is that he is grateful that his spiritual practices come with a sexual charge, or else he would have been bored and wanted it away already.
Well, yeah, that's the whole thing I talk about often with Tantra, is that it is the integration of our sexuality with our spirituality. And I want to say even more, more profoundly with our humanity. So I think one of the greatest woundings of our culture is the belief that our sexuality is somehow separate from us as human beings, and that as human beings, we are somehow separate from God inherently. Yes. Right? So
absolutely. And one of the things that I look at with Sacred Kink is that it's called, the book is called Sacred Kink, The Eightfold Paths of BDSM and Beyond. Not Eightfold Path, which I do discuss in the book, but it's based off of a writing by Raven Caldera, who wrote Hermaphrodites, and he's written a lot of books in the pagan and northern tradition shamanism communities, as well as in the power exchange communities and the kinky sex communities. And he's also an amazing intersex shaman, connected spirit worker being that I've known for a long time. he wrote an essay that was on the Eightfold Paths towards altered states of consciousness in Northern tradition shamanism. Right? Nice and short title. And he calls it Northern tradition shamanism because he's not ethnically Sami. He comes from a Germanic background, and so it's pulling upon the shamanic roots of like Norse tradition and like Odin worship, for example, and calling on the shamanic roots from that culture. And I looked at this essay that he'd written. I said, Raven, these are all things we do in SM and erotica. He's like, no, it's about shamanism. And I'm like, well, yes, but, and so the book talks about rhythm. That trance you get into when that hot sex is happening, or when a spanking is happening, or when you're just getting into that, even dancing with a lover as you're pulling on each other's hair, right? And pulling your bodies close with that rhythm can go into a trance state that goes into an ecstasy for some people and can dilate time, or can... For some people, it makes time shorter, makes things longer. Some people call this a subspace, which is short for space of submission, a submissive state. And that idea of entering into that altered state through rhythm. Because people sometimes will look at, say, somebody being whipped, right? And go, oh my God, you're painting red lashes across his body, and he's moaning and he's almost screaming, and that's horrible. And for some people, it's what I call an ordeal, which is another one of the paths, right? Those moments that you consciously choose to walk up to the precipice and dive. That ordeal state where you come out the other end of the ordeal changed. And for some people, a whipping can be an ordeal experience, can be a rite of passage, can be a transformative thing. And for other people, it's a rhythm. They're following their rhythm and just feeling the lashes dance across their skin while that perfect... I got to do a flogging scene once to a group of live drummers and having the flails land and brushing against my skin as I was literally dancing to the drums. Like just that moment. For other people, it's what I call the path of flesh, right? To become hedonistic and embrace the fullness of spirit by embracing all that you are in your skin suit. A lot of Tantra is what I would categorize as that, or another path, which is the path of breath. Those tools that we use in kinky sex, one of the tools that gets discussed is what's called breath play. And there's some people are talking about strangulation, but to me, the one that I use the most is conscious breathing in erotic practices to being able to amp up your pleasure or bring back down to a cooling state. And when you combine that with role playing or with somebody being blindfolded, and then you curl up behind them and breathe up the breath and ramp it up with a fire breath and then calm it back down while you dance your fingers across their blindfolded flesh. Like you start bringing up these things that people look at the outside and go, it's kinky sex. And I'm like, yeah, but in that moment, I become a canvas for the universe's pleasure.
Yeah, and that's, I have to say that's something that I've found in connecting with other people in the kink community is that congruency between the path of Tantra and the path of kink, because ultimately what it boils down to is mindfulness. They're just different tools for being present and aware in the body. And then kind of like and I love the shamanistic aspect because it's about kind of like poking through the veil and getting into this altered state of expanded consciousness where we leave our ego or our sense of self behind and we get to connect and experience ourselves as something different and something beyond who we thought we are.
Absolutely.
Yes, I love that. And I love what you were talking about with the ordeal. It's kind of like the walking through fire is what came to me, that analogy.
Well, and I actually bore witness to somebody who was the most, like, an ordeal that just blew me away, which it was a woman who, she'd been in the kinky sex communities actively doing really intense things with her body that, like, from the outside, you're like, okay, that's somebody who's maybe off the edge of crazy stuff, right?
Like what? Tell me.
Hanging on flush hooks.
Oh, yeah.
Right.
That's
as an example.
Yeah,
or people who are doing, and she was doing just like, skin suturing and things with blood, right? And a lot of people go, okay, that's wow. And her big thing was, I'm into edge play. I enjoy pushing my body to the edge. If she trusted somebody, she would welcome anything they did. And I bore witness to an encounter she was having at an event, and she, even though like everybody had seen that she had said, I'll take anything, I'll do anything. Don't listen to my screams of no. Don't listen to me calling red of a stoplight, because a lot of people use red, yellow, green as a stoplight system. She's like, ignore all those words. Just keep pushing me.
Wow.
And she was in this scene, and it was only about 3 minutes in, and I just heard her voice break, and she said, I was wrong. Please really stop. And just breaking down crying.
Wow.
And people, somebody else came forward and slowly untied her because she was freaking out when the two men were touching her. And I sat down with her later, and she said, it wasn't the activities that was the ordeal. It was the fact that I finally said no for the first time in my life to someone giving me touch. She'd never said no from when she had problems happening as a kid. She never said no to anything. She just took on in volunteerism. Yes. She just took on and on. And for the first time in her life, in her late 30s, she finally said no to something and had that voice of power emerge out of nowhere. And that the ordeal was not to live through something. The ordeal was get to the edge and say no.
Yes. Wow. Wow. That's so profound. I would love to just kind of do a brief little, touching point on legal issues in regards to the kink and BDSM community. So what were you sharing with me?
So there's different, the adventure of being in the United States of America, which is where I am based, is that every state has different laws around sex practices in general, right? State versus Lawrence versus the state only took care of, certain issues when it comes to dildos and things and anal sex and then all these different things. In some states, hitting your partner has no ability to be consented to. It's all considered domestic abuse. So Massachusetts is an example of that, where it's impossible to consent to being hit, which I find interesting because they allow boxing, and I consider them similar sports, but that is what it is. I went to Utah a while back, and it is legal to hit someone who has consented to it, and it is legal to wear an interesting or unusual costume, but it is illegal to wear an interesting or unusual costume while hitting someone.
So what would they define as an interesting or unusual costume? Because that's so open for interpretation.
It's so open for interpretation. Yeah. And I think that's it. That my understanding from talking to people in the local community is they were trying to pass laws that would make it illegal to be a dominatrix.
Oh, yeah. Good old Utah. I think they called pornography a epidemic health crisis or something like that.
Yeah. And so
in Utah.
Well, and it's interesting because every state is different. And so I think it's important if you're doing stuff in your bedroom and it's between you and a partner, fantastic. And if you're attending social events where you're getting together with other people and talking about these activities. And I love these social events that are out there because for me, learning about what a safe word was, I wouldn't have had that happen unless I'd gotten to go to some social gatherings. Or nowadays, I wrote a book with Melina Williams called Playing Well with Others that's all about negotiating these communities and these worlds. But for me, that's really important to get on social. But if you're going to go to a big public play party where you don't know who the host is, right? You're going to be in a space perhaps that's even at a public venue. Really make sure you know and protect yourself for where you're going and what you're doing, because most likely your hosts have done their due diligence. But I personally would rather take a moment and go, okay, I'm going to go out, I'm going to do this thing. And there's other people. I have a friend of mine who's a teacher in California. And if she was, quote, outed as being somebody who enjoys adult activities of this sort, then she would be at risk of losing her teaching license.
Yeah, so I ran into this quite a bit in the swinger community. It's very I mean, on the DL, on the down low, and you sign confidentiality agreements and that sort of thing, and no cameras, which I understand you want cameras around. But yeah, I mean, it's heartbreaking to me, which is why I'm so outspoken about what I do, since I'm self-employed and I don't have to worry about being fired, really. I'm so outspoken about what I do because I really think that we should ultimately live in a culture where people are free to include their sexuality with their humanity, with who they are, and it's really nobody else's business.
For me, it's kind of like in the LGBT community, right? That there's a lot of people who are like, be out, be proud. And I'm like, if you are moved to and can be out and be proud, please do for those who cannot be.
Yes,
through
exactly.
current circumstances, because I have no interest in shaming someone who can't or doesn't want to. I have a friend of mine who had young children who had no interest in being out and being proud because their kids were all over in Facebook and this and that. And they're like, you know what? I came up with a name that was for them, right? When they entered into the BDSM and kinky sex communities, they created a nom de plume, right? They came up with a name for themselves that was even more authentic to them because it was their chosen name.
Yes.
Rather than the name that their parents gave them. Their kids called them by the name their parents gave them.
Yes.
Right? But when they were out in the world at large, they got to choose a name. They got to manifest themselves in this new persona that was a calling to their heart.
Yes, absolutely. I hear that. And I certainly have no desire or intention of shaming people who are. I understand why people aren't out and proud. I'm just saying that I really love doing the best that I can because I have the privilege of being able to talk openly about the work that I do, of creating conversation and hopefully creating a climate where people are shame-free talking about sexuality, because I think it's unhealthy that we live in a culture where there's so much shame that we can't even say orgasm at the dinner table without people freaking out, right? And yet we can talk about war and bombs and, you know, the violence on TV is just insane. So on another note, let's talk about your new book. That was like 4 days ago, just came out.
Yeah, the ebook just came out. The print book comes out in June. It's called Traversing Gender, Understanding Transgender Realities. And I chose the word realities instead of reality, which I was originally encouraged to use. And I'm like, no, realities. Because gender is, you're talking about 7,000 different orientations out there in the world is one thing I've heard you say before. 7 million.
7 billion, yep. 7 billion.
There's 7 billion genders, I would argue, out there in the world. Mm-hmm. And there are major categories, though. And people sometimes, when they hear transgender in current media, they think of Laverne Cox or, you know, Janet Mock or you know, Caitlyn Jenner, right? Like they think of these personalities who are predominantly trans women. And trans is an adjective, right? It means to have transitioned from one part of your gender history to your new part of your journey. That's all it is. And it's from the Latin for across. Somebody is not a transgender. That woman happens to be a trans woman. She's a woman who is trans.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so thank you for that clarity, because that's really important for us to know. So it would be a trans woman, not a transgender woman.
Well, some people use transgender woman, and it's not wrong. I'm not going to vilify somebody else's use of language, but the current most used version is either transgender or trans as an adjective. What I'm talking is like in current English, very few people are using that's a transgender, period. Okay. But I do hear that sometimes used by people who are unaware. And they don't mean it poorly. They don't mean to be bad people. They're not meaning to alienate people. But it's kind of like, to me, there's a separation. It's the difference between saying that's a brunette and separating them out.
There's a Negro.
Right? And actually yeah.
It's got the same kind of feeling. There's a transgender. Yeah. It may not be intentionally ignorant, but
there's a difference between saying it's the difference between saying she's a black woman and she's a black.
Exactly. Yes. Because it's categorizing. It's like putting somebody in a box.
Yeah.
A black woman is descriptive. A black is like a thing.
Yes.
Yes.
And the challenge with transgenderism and transgender realities, it's an umbrella term, right? Just like kinky sex is, just like sex is. It's a big umbrella.
Mm-hmm.
Transgender is a big umbrella, and it's got lots of things underneath it. Everything from what I call conscious gender exploration. So drag queens, drag kings, cross-dressers, people are butch or femme. So people that I know who self-identify their gender as being a Betty Page or a burlesque performer is their real gender self. Cool. And they might be a woman who identifies as a full-blown high femme female. It's an expression of gender, right? To people who are transsexual.
Now, what is that? What's the difference between transgender and transsexual?
So that is debated. That is actively debated. Some people believe that the only people who are real transgender people are people who fit the medical profile of being transsexual. Somebody who was assigned one gender at birth is actually or identifies as the opposite gender and is pursuing legal, social, and medical realities to change themselves into their true presence. So for some people, to be a transsexual means you have to be pursuing surgeries.
Okay.
Oftentimes lower body surgeries. That isn't the
genital surgeries.
Yeah.
To change your genitals.
To change your genitals is how some people use that word. But I like the word transgender because it's all different. Of trans men, I know, so people who are assigned female at birth and identify and live as men. Some I know are on hormones. Some have not changed their body at all other than to maybe bind their chest or put a prosthetic in their underpants. Other people I know have had multiple surgeries, and if you had no history, that even some of their partners might have no idea that they are because it's part of their medical history. They don't go up to people and say, "Hi, I'm a transgender man." They say, "Hi, I'm a man."
See, and I'm glad that you're saying that because I was going to ask about that. So for someone who has undergone the transition, I wouldn't imagine that you need to attach the trans because that's kind of over and done with. They're just a man now or just a woman now. That's just what's happening now.
So it's a tricky thing. It's a big, and to even say the transition is really tricky linguistically and reality wise. For transgender women, the picture people have is that a woman has boobs, no visible Adam's apple, and a vagina, right? If we simplify woman down to being body parts and no prolific body fur, but know what that does? It takes away, it vilifies the femininity or takes away the femininity from women who are hirsute.
True. And it also takes away, I had a conversation like last year with a woman who had a cock. And she was like, "I'm a woman and I have a cock and I'm not allowed to be a woman with a cock." And I was like, well, we need to change that because I think personally, I think it's hot, but.
Exactly. And so when people say, well, now you're really a guy because, and I'm like, well, if that woman happens to have a penis, is she not a woman?
Yeah. So that's the thing. So what is the difference between sex and gender?
Okay, so if we're looking medically, we've actually got a stack of answers to that. Sex is both by external sex traits, primary sex traits, secondary sex traits, and chromosomes. So your chromosomes, XX usually manifests as woman, right, or girl. XY usually manifests as male or boy, right, usually. But there's also XXY and XO. Right? There's lots of other permutations out there, most of which are considered intersex.
Oh, we just don't hear about that, do we?
Well, and intersex is actually it's just as populated, like the population for intersex people is just as large as twins. Right? Like they're more prolific than you think. And they being unfortunately categorized as the other, but I am saying not me. And intersex people, because I know a number of intersex people, some are born with ambiguous genitalia.
Wow.
So where the doctor picks them, and primary sex traits, right? Your doctor picks you up and goes, "It's a girl," because they saw your bits.
Mm-hmm.
That's how they put the label on your birth certificate, is entirely because they looked at your genitals.
Mm-hmm.
And that's it. And so occasionally, doctors pick up the baby and go, we got a hold on this one. I'm not sure. And sometimes they'll wait a couple of days and testes will drop.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And they go, oh, okay. Others will go, okay, this person has a vagina. This child has a vagina, but they also have a penis. And until, like, in various parts of the world still, and in the United States until the 70s, it was pretty much systematic to just chop off that overly enlarged clitoris that was clear, because clitorises had no purpose other than, they don't have a purpose on women, right? And so they were castrating intersex babies.
Well, and they cut off foreskin, so that doesn't surprise me. To this day, you got to argue with people to not cut off the tip of your infant boy's penis. I mean, it's just insane. So that doesn't surprise me that they would just hack it off.
Yeah. And so you have intersex children that are out there. And so that's sex, right? Primary sex traits is I am looking at your naked body. Mm-hmm. Chromosomes, I'm looking at your blood. Right? And then the third is secondary sex traits, which is you hit puberty, what happens?
Yes. Right.
Does the person have boobs? Do they develop wide hips? Do they get large muscular shoulders? Do they? And there are some people where you go, oh, in a given culture, you go, oh, that's a man. They're becoming a man. Right? But in our culture, in the United States, where man is seen as broad shoulders and thin hips and, musculature and body hair and this and that and grow a beard. If I'm talking to a small-framed Thai man who will never look like that, it's why some Asian men are referred to in Western culture as effeminate. Right. And it's because they stereotype men as looking like this.
Yes. Yes. Yeah. And the danger of all this is that it doesn't allow people the freedom to be who and what they choose to be. And I mean, and I understand it's a way of I guess it's a way of keeping order and control in our society, right?
Absolutely. And so those are sex. Gender comes in a lot of different forms. There's assigned gender. It's what your doctor says you are. Or parents said you are. You're a girl. It's what the you are is, right? There's perceived gender. Somebody looks at you now as an adult and goes, oh, you are, or you must be. Usually figured out by what you're wearing, right? Sometimes people will see you across the room and be like, oh, yeah, that's cool. It's some dude. And then you turn around, it's like, oh, never mind. And they start rewriting their story. But from behind, you were in the men's jeans, you were in the men's shirt, based on some wardrobe or what your posture was or the height of your shoes. Perceived gender.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I had that issue with with my girlfriend. Is she wore glasses and had short hair and liked to wear boys' clothes, and we'd go out and people would walk up to us and refer to her as sir, and she'd just be so pissed.
Right, and it's because of the perceived gender.
Exactly.
Right? There's also gender identity, which is how do I identify with my own gender? Yes. How do I see myself? Which may have nothing to do with any of the above or match all of the above. And then there's also gender performance, which is all the tools out there that are involved with gender, makeup and wardrobe and body posture and tone of your voice versus tone of your voice. Right? What are the tools you are using to perform a gender in this moment? RuPaul said it really well, which is we're all born naked and the rest of it's drag. And so looking at our gender performances, the fact that in our culture, right, pink is a girl's color and blue is a boy's color, right? The color of beret you put on your baby.
Yes. Or if you put on a beret, or if you put on a right? The color of your little onesies.
Yeah. And those moments when, and there's been a movement in some countries to have gender neutral parenting so that the kid can figure out for themselves, like, do you want to play with dolls or dinosaurs? Do you want, and it's funny because people still say from from my generation, right, from being in my mid to late 30s, a lot of people are like, oh, yeah, boys play with trucks and girls play with dolls. And actually, if you look at the current studies, girls play with spaceships. And boys play with My Little Ponies. Like, let's look at what's actually happening here.
Yep. I remember that issue coming up with my brother. Like, my mom bought him Barbie dolls because he went, and it was like a big scandal. You know, my brother's 39. It was like scandalous. So yeah, such brilliant conversation and such an in-depth study. So we are coming to the end of our show, sadly. So I would love for you to share with people where they can find this book and all of your amazing work. And you're going on tour. You're going to be like everywhere, right?
I am. So this book, which also includes a lot of skills for if you're an ally, for people who have family members, for people who have schools that have trans kids, if you're a medical professional, or if you're transgender yourself, the book has lots of resources for everyone. And that's available actually already on Amazon, and better yet, at all of your fine bookstores, so that you can go and order it and support a local retailer.
Yeah.
Just going to throw that out there. As well as all my other books, Sacred Kink, Playing Well with Others, and feel free to just type in Lee Harrington on the internet, and you either get me or a lovely woman who wrote books about traveling to India and about dog walking. So she's great. I love her. She's a wonderful woman. And my website, again, is passionandsoul.com.
And so do you have a calendar on your website?
I do. If you click on the appearances button, it's there. And coming up, there's a conference I'm going to in the Poconos, followed by teaching in Delaware and up to Maine. And then I'm back out to Maryland in June.
Oh, wonderful. Well, thank you so much for taking the time to be here with us this evening, Lee. It was just brilliant to have you.
Oh, it's great to talk to you again. I love spending brain time with you.
Yay, me too.
And heart time.
Yes, yeah, I love connecting with you. So we'll have to do more. When you come out to Seattle, which I'm sure you will, I will be here and we can play.
I love it.
Yay. Okay. Well, thank you, Lee, and thank you everyone for listening. And if you want to stay connected with me, you can find me at DeviWordTantra.com and TibetanTantra.com, as well as on Facebook, Devi Word Tantra LLC, and Twitter, of course. And make sure you check out Lee at PassionandSoul.com.